Chapter 10. Hand over that thief. "Quiet, men," Ichik said, his chest heaving in and out. "It won't be long now." But Rick noted that the king of Itzamal was breathing just as loudly as the rest of them. They'd run several miles through the hot and humid jungle, taking the long road out of town, as Ichik called it. Sweat streamed down Rick's face, stinging his eyes, salting his lips, but he tried to follow orders and breathe more quietly. The plan was to take a different route than the men from Kalakmul, circling around to cut them off from the front. Once they saw the men emerge on the path, Rick would spring into action. His particular role in Ichik's plan was by far the most dangerous, but he wasn't complaining. This was his purpose now, to help the people of Kisa's village. And if helping them meant putting his life at risk, that's exactly what he'd do. "Easy, men," Ichik said, regaining his breath. As they waited, Rick thought about how different his new life would be. A few days ago, he was 1,000% committed to the historian mission. It was the very blood that pumped through his veins, and always would. But today, he was going to step away from the front lines of the historian struggle. His loyalty now belonged to the people of Itzamal and Kisa. His heart hammered inside his chest as he imagined waking up in this jungle village for the rest of his days. Ichik turned to Rick, said, "You ready, son?" "I'm ready, sir," Rick said. "Remember, just toss the codex over your shoulder when you get it. Huracan will be there to pick it up." "Yes, sir." Rick glanced back at Huracan. The man nodded to him. Then Rick glanced at the man who had possession of the trial codex. It was inside a leather bag slung across his shoulder. Rick whipped his head back around when he heard hushed voices coming from the path. Men from Kalakmul were approaching. He raised up into a squat, readying himself to scamper through the dense foliage and onto the footpath, but Ichik held Rick by the elbow and shook his head. "Not yet," he mouthed, pointing toward the path. Rick saw that there were 6 men walking in a tight formation, but none of them had been in the temple with Pakal, and there was no sign of the codex. "They were telling the truth," Ichik whispered back to his men. "They have reinforcements." After the men had passed, Ichik continued. "I've seen this tactic before. They have a group of men lead the way, scouting the path. Then we will see a middle group, which will likely include the men who took the codex. And finally, there will be a scout group bringing up the rear. We will have to act quickly, men. Our plan will have to be fully executed before the final group is upon us." Rick expected to see the second group right away, but there was more waiting. And the longer he waited, the more questions came into his head. What if he couldn't wrestle the codex away from whomever was carrying it? What if he failed in his very first role as a member of Kisa's community? Or what if the men who'd stolen the codex went a completely different way? He wiped sweat from his forehead and swallowed. If there really was going to be a second group, what was taking them so long? Seconds later, he heard the cracking of branches in the jungle behind him and spun around. The rest of the men turned around too, some brandishing their knives. To Rick's complete surprise, it was Sera who emerged, with Dak. One of the warriors put a finger to his lips, urging them to keep quiet. But Dak snuck over to Rick anyway and knelt beside him. "You have to come with us," he whispered. "You're walking around again?" Rick said. "I'm more than just walking around." Dak stood up and did a stupid 5-second dance, then knelt back down. "Seriously, though, you need to come with us." "Can't do it," Rick said. Sara leaned over their shoulders, whispering in Spanish so that their translators would have to recalibrate, allowing them a moment of privacy within the crowd. "We figured out the riddle, Rick. We're supposed to take the codex with us, and I was able to work out the second date from the riddle. It's in 1562. That must be our next stop." Rick balked. "Why would you take the codex with you?" Ichik shot them both a look. Rick knew he couldn't understand what they were saying, but he wanted them to be silent. To protect it?" Dak whispered. "Sara told me some guys already tried to steal it. We both believe this is the break we're supposed to fix before we move on, and we seriously need to move on." Rick looked over his shoulder at Sara, who was nodding. He turned back to Dak, who whispered, "Come on, dude, be a team player." "If you don't quit bothering me," Rick whispered back, "we'll never get the codex back. We're waiting for the people who have it to pass. Now go on, Shoo! I see, Dak said, rubbing his hands together. Finally, a bit of that Mayan warmongering I've been hoping for. Rick shook his head. The kid was much easier to get along with when he was unconscious. Look, Dak whispered. One of us has to grab it so we can warp the heck out of this place. Sera has the ring all programmed and ready to go. Here's an idea. Let's live to fix another break. This place has been hard on my system. Rick stared at Dak, trying to decide the best way to break the news that he wasn't going anywhere, because it was definitely best to get that part out of the way. I wanted to talk to you about that, Dak, he began. I've been doing a lot of thinking over the last couple days. Well, there's a step in the right direction, Dak said. Ha. Anyway, I'm just going to come out and say it. I'm not going to continue on from... Rick wasn't able to finish his sentence because right then, Itchik grabbed his elbow again and pointed down at the path. Rick turned and saw 5 men walking up the hill, including the 2 he'd seen in the temple earlier. One of them had the folded-up codex tucked under his left arm. Rick furiously waved Dak away. This was his moment. Itchik held onto Rick's elbow until the last possible second. Then he pushed Rick out from behind the trees. Rick's adrenaline kicked in as he scampered down the densely packed hill, shouting at the Kalakmul men, "Take me with you, please! They'll kill me!" The men stopped, clearly caught off guard. The front 3 pulled their knives. Itchik and a few of his warriors followed Rick down the hill, commanding, "Stop that boy! He is to be punished for his crimes!" Rick pushed past the first row of Kalakmul men and jumped onto the man holding the codex. "Please!" he continued shouting. "They'll kill me!" "Get off him!" the men with knives shouted. One slashed Rick's cheek, blood instantly trickling down his face and neck. But Rick kept his wits about him. He had to execute the plan. He yanked the codex out of the man's hands, still pleading for help, and tossed it over his shoulder. Rick glanced back in time to see Huracan pick it up and pretend to hand it to Itchik, who already had the trial codex in his possession. Itchik then thrust the trial codex up over his head and shouted, "Men, this belongs to you. Take back your codex and display it in the greatest empire in all the land. All I ask in return is that you hand over that thief." The Kalakmul men were busy kicking at Rick and slugging him in the back and head. Rick covered himself and closed his eyes, and he could now hear Dak and Sara screaming for the men to stop, but the beating didn't stop until Itchik stepped over Rick and waved everyone away. He handed over the trial codex and pulled Rick to his feet, only to slug him square in the jaw. Rick was face down on the path again, with no memory of falling. "Take him," Itchik shouted back at his warriors. Several of Itchik's men picked Rick up and held his arms behind his back as Itchik announced, "This boy was caught looting huts in the wake of the great storm. He will be punished in the square." Rick was slightly dazed from all the abuse he'd taken, but he was still clear-headed enough to smile on the inside. The plan was working perfectly. The Kalakmul men had backed off. Huracan had already left for the village to hide the real codex. The man holding the fake looked through a few pages of glyphs, but didn't seem to have any clue that there was a difference. Itchik commanded to his men, "Lead him back, now." But before they could take Rick anywhere, one of the Kalakmul men said, "Why not sacrifice him right here in the jungle? Isn't that what a thief deserves?" "Yeah, do him in now," another shouted, "so we can watch." "No," a voice from the crowd yelled. Rick looked up to see Kisa hurrying through the foliage and onto the path. "He didn't steal anything," she shouted, shoving one of the men who held Rick. The man laughed, managing to keep a hold of Rick. "It's okay," Rick said to Kisa under his breath. Kisa ignored Rick and shouted at Itchik, "He didn't steal anything. It's all a bunch of lies." Many of the Kalakmul men were laughing now, which meant, Rick realized, they were no longer calling for his head. Itchik played along with Kisa's assertion by commanding, "We will attend to this matter back in the village. A verdict on the thief will be made by this evening so the gods can bear witness." Then he turned to the visitors from Kalakmul and said, "Men, I thank you for capturing the prisoner. Please give my regards to Yuknum the Great." They all nodded. One said, "A couple of our men are missing. If you come across those misfeats, you can try them before the gods too," another man interjected. All the Calakmul men laughed. The first man continued, "Tell them we're already on our way to the next village." "Of course," Ichik said. Rick couldn't believe his eyes. The men from Calakmul were all turning and continuing down the jungle path away from Itzamal. The plan had worked. Ichik's men were all quietly congratulating one another as Rick reached up to touch his bloody cheek. "Kisa," Ichik said, grinning from ear to ear. "How you always innately sense what's happening, I'll never understand." "You knew it was all part of the plan?" Rick asked. Kisa nodded. "I knew Ichik would never strike an unarmed person. It had to be an act." Rick saw that she was holding a metal locket with a chain. "Yes, I'm very sorry about the punch," Ichik said. "You've sacrificed so much for us, son." Rick felt a rush of pride as he watched Ichik join his men, but there was a worried look on Kisa's face. "What's wrong?" he asked her. "You will not stay here," she said. "What do you mean?" Rick said. "I thought it was all settled." "I've changed my mind. I want you to go." Rick's whole body felt suddenly paralyzed. "I don't understand," he said. "Earlier you said—" "It only matters what I'm saying now," she said, with a stern look on her face. "Please go, Rick." Dak and Sara pushed through the men to get to him. "Wow," Dak said. "You took some serious abuse." "Are you okay?" Sara asked. "We tried to rush down here to help, but the men hiding in the bushes stopped us and told us all about the plan. You agreed to this?" Rick nodded, but he could hardly follow Sara's words. He was too numb from what Kisa had just said to him. He watched her back away, wondering what had changed. Why was she so against him staying now? "We're leaving right this second," Dak said. "We heard there might be another group coming through here, and I don't want to take any chances." Sara was already kneeling down into the path and reaching into her satchel for the ring. She pulled it out and powered it on. Rick looked at Kisa. He decided he had to stay anyway. She would come around in time. "Dak, Sara," he began. "This is very hard for me to say, but—" "Do you all have everything you need?" Kisa interrupted, pushing herself forward again. "I think we do," Dak said. He turned to Rick. "Sara and I now believe the Codex is supposed to remain here in the village under Kisa and Pakal's protection. Right, Sara? You think our mission was just to get it back from those men?" "I'm positive," Sara answered, looking up. "Which we've done, thanks to you, Rick." "Honestly," Dak said. "Great work, dude." Rick was going to try one more time to explain he intended to stay, but then he saw the callous look on Kisa's face, like he suddenly disgusted her. And then one of Ichik's men said, "Look!" His finger was pointing down the path to where a third group of Calakmul men was fast approaching. There were at least 15 men marching in formation, less than 50 yards away. "Come on!" Dak shouted at Sara. "We need to do this now!" "I'm trying!" Sara shouted back. Ichik and his men were already retreating up into the jungle. Rick grabbed Kisa's arm before she could go and said, "You really want me to leave?" She stared back at him, completely straight-faced, and said simply, "Yes." Then she handed Rick the locket. Rick looked at the snake carved into the front of it. Then he looked up at Kisa, his heart breaking. "But I thought—" "You thought wrong," she said, cutting him off. He let her go, the only thing he could do, and watched her disappear into the bushes. "Stay where you are!" one of the Calakmul men shouted at Rick, Dak, and Sara. Rick turned and saw the men hurrying toward them. "No, Sara!" Dak shouted. "Got it!" she shouted back. "Grab on!" Rick reluctantly reached for a part of the ring, staring up at the tree Kisa had just ducked behind. His face stung, and his back and ribs and head were pulsing with pain, but that was nothing compared to the pain he felt inside. Something had changed for Kisa. She no longer wanted him around. The men were less than 10 yards away when Sara shouted, "Here we go!" The ring brightened, and Rick was so jarred by the abrupt feeling of its power that he accidentally dropped the locket onto the ground. "Wait!" he shouted, reaching down for it, but just before he could wrap his fingers around the snake's metal tail, he was whisked away into blackness, and it was lost. Chapter 11. What Sara Saw. Sara is sucked right back into her memory of the cataclysm. She sees herself in the small, motorized emergency raft again, speeding through intersection after intersection, and she's screaming, begging for all of it to stop. The fires, the flooding, the acid rain pouring down from above, the earth's violent shaking. Sara zips past several miles of absolute destruction until she's out of the city and turns onto her childhood street. She lets off the gas as she nears her house, then dives overboard and walks her way up the flooded driveway. When she reaches a trembling hand out for the doorknob, she half expects to black out or be whisked away, like every other time she's tried to access her memory of the cataclysm. But this time, she remains present. She watches herself slowly turn the knob, push open the door, creep inside the only home she's ever known. "Uncle Diego?" she calls out. No answer. Sara moves through the living room, leaving the front door wide open behind her. The wood floors are covered in 2 feet of grayish water. Many of her uncle's possessions are submerged or floating randomly. Books, documents, framed photos, candles, old newspapers and magazines, vases. Most of the furniture is overturned. A leg is missing from the dining room table. The TV is knocked over and punctured. The mirror below the clock is shattered and hanging askew. It looks like someone has ransacked the place, looking for something. But what? The kitchen is even worse. The fridge is wide open and mostly cleaned out, its door ripped from the hinges. The cupboards are full of broken plates and glasses. Sara stops cold when she sees the empty wooden knife block. The utensil drawer is still full of forks and spoons, but the knives are gone. Where are the knives? "Uncle Diego?" she calls out again. Nothing. Sara sloshes out of the kitchen, but when she rounds the corner, she lets out a short scream. There, frozen on the stairs, is a rail-thin man wearing her uncle's raincoat. Long, unkempt hair and shaggy beard, bugged eyes. The man looks half dead already. Sara's heart is beating inside her throat as she says, "Who are you?" Instead of answering, the man leaps down the rest of the stairs and splashes his way across the living room. "Stop!" Sara shouts, but he's already out the door. She bounds up the waterlogged stairs, her whole body now wired with fear. What if something happened to her uncle? She pushes open her own bedroom door first. A few items are scattered around the floor, but otherwise it's the way she left it. She continues to her uncle's bedroom door and reaches for the doorknob, preparing herself for what she might find. She slowly pushes open the door and looks around. There's an unfamiliar sleeping bag in the middle of the room, trash piled in the far corner, but nothing else out of the ordinary. The man she'd just seen had most likely been living there, but for how long? And where was her uncle? That's when it hit Sara. She has to go and see about the barn. The rushing water is up to Sara's waist as she steps up to the front door of the barn. She has to keep a wide stance and lean against the current to keep from getting swept away. Before she pulls open the heavy door, she flashes back to all the remnants she's had over the years, many of which have involved this very barn. She's always known it's important, but she's afraid to find out why. Sara forces herself to pull open the door, and as soon as it's halfway open, she peeks her head inside and sees a body floating face up in the water. She immediately falls to her knees, sobbing. Her Uncle Diego, the only family she's ever known. His face strangely contorted, eyes wide open. She covers her own face and then slaps down at the water and stands back up. Behind her uncle, she spots 4 more bodies, all floating face down. She moves toward them, hiccuping and gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. Her right hand shakes as she reaches out for the dead man's cold arm, turns over his body, It's a face she's never seen before, but at the same time, it's oddly familiar. She turns over a dead woman next to him, which evokes the same strange feeling. She can't pinpoint the familiarity, but it's incredibly powerful. The third and fourth bodies make her fall to her knees again, slapping at the water and shouting, "No, please!" Dak's parents. She buries her face in her hands and cries so hard that strange animal sounds are escaping from her throat, and she can hardly breathe. And then a horrific thought occurs to her, and she looks up at the first two bodies again. She stares at their faces. Then she looks at Dak's parents again, and back at her uncle. The two unknown faces are oddly familiar, oddly like her own face. "No," she whispers, moving back toward the first man again, studying his eyes and mouth. "No." She reaches into his back pocket for his wallet, then pulls out his ID and reads the name. Daniel Frost. Her father. She stares down at the man without crying or breathing, and then she looks at the woman. Her mother. Then she angles her own face up at the ceiling and screams so piercingly loud her ears continue ringing long after she closes her mouth. The parents she's never known have come back for her, and now they're dead. Sara rips at her own hair and forces her head underwater, right cheek pressed up against the muddy ground. She stays like this until her lungs burn and her thoughts grow thin and disappear, and she can no longer stand the pain in her chest. Still, she refuses to let herself up, and then the memory slips away, and she is lost. Chapter 12. 1,000 years later. Sara opened her eyes, shaking uncontrollably. Her body no longer felt real now that she'd broken through her repressed memory of the cataclysm. She felt fake, made up. Though she was clearly sitting on the clay dirt behind a massive building, it felt like she was floating, 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 up into the sky, into nothingness. Everyone was going to die, including the parents she'd always dreamed about. They would die trying to fight their way back to her. She'd find them in her uncle's barn. Her remnants would forever take on an entirely different meaning. Sara turned and saw Dak and Rick looking around, taking in their new environment, which wasn't new so much as updated. They'd landed in the exact same place they'd landed the last time they warped, Mayan country, Izamal, in a large patch of tall, thick grass. Except where the fallen observatory rubble once lay, a beautiful new observatory, twice the size of its predecessor, now stood. Ichik had done exactly what he had promised, and the temple, where Sara had just watched Bakal paint a ceiba tree into the codex, had been transformed into a massive church. Judging by the sun, it was late afternoon. The people walking the raised white road in the distance were a combination of traditional Mayas and white men dressed in pious robes. Sara knew right away they were the Franciscan monks she'd read about, the ones who settled in Mayan villages and tried to convert the indigenous people to their own religious beliefs. "I'm not saying anything this time," Dak suddenly announced. Sara found Dak staring at her. Poor Dak. Her best friend had no idea what she'd found in her Uncle Diego's barn. "Nope," Dak said, shaking his head. "I refuse to even bring up the fact that tears are literally streaming down your face. My lips are sealed." Sara couldn't bring herself to tell him about his parents. It was too awful, and it was way off in the future. At the same time, Dak was so worried about his parents being lost in time. Wouldn't he want to know that they'd made their way back? Sara stared at Dak, trying to decide if it was better to know the unbearable truth or live as long as possible in happy ignorance. "Know why I'm keeping quiet?" Dak said. "Because it's none of my business. Who am I to point out that you're shaking like a hairless dog in the snow?" "It's just the warp again," Sara managed to say. Dak held up his hand, saying, No need even discuss it, Sara. I'm steering clear of your hysterics from now on. He turned to Rick, said, I see Loverboy over here has the same strategy. Rick didn't even look up. Wow, Dak said, turning back to Sara. What's wrong with you people? Last time I checked, I was the one who nearly got decapitated by a falling wall. Sara tried to think of something lighthearted to say back, to at least pretend things were normal, but her mind drew a blank. Every time she looked at Dak, she remembered turning over the bodies of his dead parents, and that made her remember the faces of her own dead parents, too, and her Uncle Diego. Dak pulled the square out of Rick's satchel, shaking his head. He turned on the power. Nobody has a sense of humor anymore, he said, typing something on the keyboard. What we're doing isn't easy. I understand that, but we have to keep our composure, right? I mean, we have a fairly important job to do. He looked up at Sara. We have to save the world. Sara wiped her tear-stained face on the arm of her huipo and said, I'm pretty sure we're all aware of that, Dak. Just cut us some slack. Dak motioned toward Rick with his thumb and said, I saw what happened to the Rickster over here. His girlfriend or whatever tried to give him a parting gift, a locket or something, but he dropped it. Isn't that right, Rick? Sara watched Rick turn to Dak, scowling. Dak was oblivious, of course. See, that's why I tell all my bros back home to steer clear of the lovey-dovey stuff. It's asking for trouble, dude. You want my advice? If you absolutely have to interact with the opposite sex, make sure it's with a girl you can treat like one of the guys, like Sara. He kicked at her with one of his feet. Wow, Sara said. That's so sweet of you. Sara might have slugged Dak in the ribs if she hadn't just remembered finding his dead and bloated parents during the cataclysm. Rick stood up suddenly. Without saying a word, he walked away. Hey, Dak called after him. You can't leave. It's going to be dark soon, and we're supposed to stick together. Rick didn't even turn around. Rick, Sara shouted, but he'd already rounded the corner of the new observatory, out of sight. She turned to Dak. You happy now? Was it something I said? Sara rolled her eyes. When is it not something you said? I was just offering the guy a little romantic guidance. Dak shook his head. Some people are too sensitive. We should go after him, Sara said. She stood up and looked around to try to get her bearings. It was odd seeing all the things that had changed, the updated huts and new trees and paved streets, but at the same time, everything felt so familiar. Fine, Dak said. But first, let's look at the latest riddle I just pulled up. Dak turned the square around so Sara could read the screen. To save the reproduction of the treasure's truth, do the following. Seek the help of those who follow the most important thing in the world. Then dig deep, deeper, deepest, unlocking a long-locked door. It will take a polyglot to understand the wisdom of the glyphs and the forgery of the curse. Sara read it twice, and then she stood back up, shaking her head. I don't get it. Neither do I. She wasn't surprised the difficulty of the riddles was increasing. She knew that the historians hadn't had time to completely program the square. Things were more vague now. The further they got into the breaks, the less information they would have. What the heck is the most important thing in the world? Dak said. Sara shook her head. No idea. It seems like an extension of the first riddle, though, Dak said. Both talk about truth and the treasure and the curse. The treasure is the codex, Sara said. We know that much. And the curse is about the cataclysm described in the Great Mayan Codex. Sara just looked at Dak for a few long seconds. According to Pakal, there was never any mention of a cataclysm in his codex. None? Sara shook her head, trying not to think about what she knew about the cataclysm. And what does the riddle mean by a reproduction? Dak asked. I still wonder if we should have just taken Pakal's codex with us. Sara was having trouble concentrating now. She'd stare at the words, unlocking a long-locked door, and all of a sudden she'd find herself remembering the cataclysm again. her flooded barn, the bodies she had to turn over. "A polyglot has something to do with language, right?" Dak said. "I'm not sure," Sara said. "But I know someone who would. We really need to go find Rick. We should all be doing this together. And that means you might have to go easy on him for a little while." "I guess you're right," Dak said, standing up. He looked at Sara. "You know, I really did see him drop a piece of jewelry that Snake Girl had just given him." Sara had seen the way Rick looked at Kisa. It couldn't have been easy for him to say goodbye. "You missed a few things while you were recovering in the cave," she said. "I figured as much." They started walking around the corner of the observatory, in the direction they'd seen Rick go. As soon as they rounded the corner, Sara nearly ran right into a teenage boy. It wasn't Rick, though. It was a Mayan boy who had a large bag slung over his left shoulder. He wore an outfit similar to Dak's. "Sorry," he said. "It's okay," she said, her translator device kicking in to match his dialect. He straightened his bag and said, "Well, have a nice evening." He started to leave, but then turned around and looked over Sara and Dak for a few seconds, noting their attire, before saying, "A bunch of us are meeting in the cave in a little while, if you're interested in practicing the old ways." "Maybe we'll join you," Dak said. Sara and Dak watched the boy hurry along the path that Sara remembered led out of the village and up toward the cave. Dak poked her on the shoulder and said, "A bunch of Mayas racing off to the cave. Isn't this exactly how things started off last time?" "It is," Sara said. But she had a sneaking suspicion that the cave served a much different function in 1562. Chapter 13. This is who we are. The warping that seemed so hard on everyone else was practically therapeutic for Dak. He couldn't believe how much better he felt as he and Sara continued to wander the village in search of Rick. Only a few days ago, a few days ago plus a millennium, a wall had fallen on his head. How many people had had an actual stone wall fall on their head? The number had to be fairly low, and Dak was just walking around like it was nothing. He had to admit, it was a little superhero-esque. "I'm back, baby," he muttered under his breath. And being back meant fixing the brakes, saving the world, all of it hopefully leading to a heartfelt reunion with his parents that would be shown live on some kind of morning news show. And no, he wouldn't be rocking the breechcloth on national TV. "I don't see Rick anywhere," Sara said, as they moved down a less crowded village path, about 100 yards from the observatory. Dak stopped walking and surveyed the scene. The huts were more modern now and slightly larger, and they were packed in more tightly. He turned to Sara. "Dude, we have to start thinking like the guy. Where would you go if you were in love with a charming snake charmer who's been deceased for approximately a millennium?" Sara shot him a disapproving look. "What?" Dak said. "I'm trying to put myself in the mind of the missing." "Not funny." Sara started walking again. "You have to admit," Dak said, following her, "it was pretty wild what she did with all those snakes." Sara picked up a rock, tossed it down the path in front of them. "All I know is we were lucky to get out of there alive." "I'll give you that." Dak watched another small group of Mayas hurry past, with bags slung over their shoulders, all of them glancing back down the road behind them, like they were doing something they weren't supposed to. It suddenly occurred to Dak how much these people's lives must have changed since the arrival of the Spanish. One thing was for sure, Dak no longer viewed the Maya as untrustworthy. History hadn't given them nearly enough credit, which made him wonder what else history had gotten wrong. "What do you think that sculpture symbolizes?" Sara asked, motioning toward the one in front of a stone wall that surrounded a small cluster of huts. It looked like a face partially covered by a net or scales. "I've seen it in a few different places now." "I've seen it too," Dak said. "My guess is it reads, 'In honor of Dak Smith, our eternal hero.'" "Yeah, that's it," Sara scoffed. "Because of, how I saved that little girl or whatever. You saw all the flowers and food they left me, right?" Sara rolled her eyes. Another group of Mayas passed by, slightly larger than the one before. "Excuse me," Sara said to the last young woman. She pointed at the sculpture. "Do you know what that means?" "Of course," the woman said, backpedaling as she spoke to Sara. "It's the secret symbol of friendship." "Secret symbol of friendship?" Dak said. "That's weird. If it's so secret, why is it in so many different places?" The woman looked Dak up and down. It was clear she hadn't noticed him when she'd spoken to Sara. "I'm sorry, but we're actually in a hurry," the woman said. She turned back around and jogged a few steps to catch up with her friends. Dak looked at Sara. Clearly, she was intimidated by my imposing physique. "That's probably what it was," Sara said. "Why don't you let me do the talking from now on?" Dak shrugged. He had to admit that Sara did a better job of blending in here. "Suit yourself. Anyway, it sure seems like a lot of people are heading up to the cave. Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" "What?" "That we should follow them. Check out what's going on." Sara put her hands on her hips and looked away from Dak for a few seconds. He followed her eyes down the alley, where two Franciscan monks were walking side by side in stuffy-looking robes. "We can't just leave Rick," Sara said. "We're not leaving him," Dak told her. "We're just momentarily suspending our search. Besides, isn't this mission bigger than any one person? That's what Rick always says. Just because he's off somewhere pining over Medusa doesn't mean the rest of us are supposed to stop working." Sara was staring at Dak with a sad expression on her face, like she felt sorry for him. He'd caught her staring at him this way a number of times since they landed here. He didn't understand. Why would anyone feel sorry for him? Was it because of his parents? Sure, it was rotten luck they'd been lost in the river of time, but they'd be reunited. And in the meantime, he was busy living history, fixing it where it needed to be fixed. "Look," Dak said, breaking eye contact. "I promise we'll come right back down, unless you want to stick around for a conversation with those guys." He motioned toward the monks. "Fine," Sara said. "We'll go check it out. Then we're coming right back down here and finding Rick." Dak pumped his fist a few times, then waved for Sara to follow him. He didn't know what to expect from a secret Mayan meeting, but it was bound to be worth seeing. Dak and Sara climbed the boulders in front of the cave and took a few steps inside. The musty smell brought back a slew of memories for Dak. He remembered waking up on the makeshift cot with a man wearing feathers, burning herbs over his chest. He remembered watching Sara's lips move as she spoke to him in words he couldn't quite hear, but mostly he remembered the strange visions he'd had throughout his recovery. There was the one where he was trapped inside a well, or the one where he was climbing through a cramped tunnel that never seemed to end, but the strangest vision of all was the one where Sara had come to him and revealed that Ichik was her father. Dak peeked at Sara now as she studied the several dozen Mayas gathered inside the cave. If Sara traced her family tree back far enough, he wondered if it would lead her all the way back to this very village. "All right, my good people," a young Mayan man suddenly announced. "Bring it in a little tighter, please." They moved deeper inside the cave, some of them holding candles or masks or food offerings. Sara led Dak behind a large limestone sculpture where they were hidden. "We can listen for a few minutes," she whispered. "But then we're going back to find Rick." "Fine," Dak whispered back. "As you all know," the man continued, "there are rumors that Diego de Landa will physically punish anyone caught paying respect to our spiritual ancestors. We have begun to meet in these caves because the monks believe they are haunted. That provides us some measure of safety. Any newcomers, tonight you will join us in honoring Amun, Chanku, Chak, Kinich Aja, and many others, in our traditional ways, because this is who we are, yes?" Dak watched everyone nod and echo. "This is who we are." He'd never seen anything like it. "Good," the man said. "Now pull out whatever you have brought, and let us begin." Anyone who had a bag reached into it now and pulled out some type of artifact. Dak saw them produce codices, masks, figurines, elaborate costumes and headdresses, incense sticks, detailed tapestries. "They might be able to change the way we believe out there," the man said, pointing outside the cave. "But they can never change the way we believe in here." He tapped his thumb against his chest several times and repeated, "Never in here." Without any further direction, the Mayas all began chanting together and dancing. A few held masks up to their faces and bowed to the people around them. Dak turned to Sara and whispered, "You heard what he said is going on, right? Diego de Landa is a Franciscan monk known for traveling to the most remote Mayan villages to try to convert all the indigenous people to Christianity. According to most historical accounts, he was the single most influential figure in the suppression of Mayan—" "Be quiet, Dak," Sara interrupted. "Just watch and listen. Maybe you'll learn something." Dak grinned. "Look who's starting to admire the Maya," he whispered. They both spun around quickly when they heard voices coming from the opening of the cave. Dak saw 5 large men, dressed much differently than the Mayas, peering in at the processions. They didn't seem to notice Dak and Sara hiding behind the sculpture. One of the men pointed at the Mayas and nodded, and they all moved into the cave together. Dak pushed down Sara's head and ducked himself so the men wouldn't see them as they passed by. One of the Spaniards shouted at the Mayas, "Every one of you must come with us. There's no use trying to get away." Each of the 5 men produced either crossbows or muskets. The chanting and dancing immediately stopped. Many of the Mayas held up their hands and surrendered peacefully, but others sprinted toward the cave exit, pushing past the Spaniards on their way by, knocking 2 of the men over. The 3 men who remained standing opened fire on the fleeing Mayas. One young Mayan man fell onto his stomach when an arrow pierced his back. He hopped back up and staggered a few more steps and then collapsed back onto the ground. The surrendered Mayas all gasped as the injured man went still. Sara made a move for the dying man, but Dak grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "They can't know we're here," he shouted. Sara turned her glassy eyes toward Dak, but said nothing. "Let's make this easy, folks," one of the Spaniards announced. "We don't want any more casualties." The Mayas were all let out of the cave in connected shackles, heads bowed. The injustice of it all bubbled inside Dak's chest. All they had been doing was celebrating their history. Dak could relate. History was everything to him, too. What if someone shot at him for studying the Second Roman Empire? He watched one of the Spaniards shove the last Mayas toward the exit of the cave, and then they were gone. They had just left the dead Mayan man to rot. "They killed him," Sara cried, stepping out from behind the limestone sculpture. "And we did nothing." "What could we have done?" Dak said. Sara knelt down beside the fallen man and closed his eyelids. "And for what?" she said, choking up as she spoke. "What did he die for?" Dak knelt beside her. "It isn't fair," he said. "Maybe this is why we're here, Sara, to make sure the Maya are no longer treated this way, or maybe we're here to change the way they're perceived by future generations." Sara didn't say anything. She just kept staring down at the man, shaking her head. Dak moved deeper into the cave. He picked up one of the colorful masks and studied the details. Then he knelt down and flipped through several codices lying in the clay dirt. None of them had a painting of a ceiba tree. He moved over to a large wooden box filled with smaller masks and figurines and traditional-looking jewelry. He picked up a paintbrush, then a colorfully painted ceramic, an old locket similar to the one Kisa had tried to give Rick. Then he found several small ceramic instruments that resembled modern drums and flutes. "Leave me alone!" Sara suddenly shouted. Dak spun around to find a large Spanish man restraining Sara's hands behind her back. The man looked up at Dak and said, "Let's go, boy. Don't make it any harder than it has to be." Sara tried to wrestle away from the man, but he whacked her in the back of the head with an elbow and tightened her restraints. "Don't touch her!" Dak shouted. "Then get over here," the man shouted back. Dak reached back into the box and dug around for the locket. He pulled it out and hid it in his breechcloth as he stood up. The Spaniard was already shoving Sara toward Dak and readying a second restraint. Chapter 14. Wisdom in a Prison Cell. "In you go," a Spanish guard shouted, shoving Sara and Dak into a large cell that already held dozens of Mayas, many of whom Sara had just seen inside the cave. "You killed my brother!" a Mayan girl shrieked, running toward the open door. "Not me personally," the man said, grinning. "But maybe one of my colleagues." Another guard held the girl back with a long club. "Brother de Landa warned you about practicing your witchcraft, but do any of you listen? No!" He slammed closed the door and locked it, shouting through the sliding peephole. "There's a price to pay for choosing the devil's path!" The guards left, and the young Mayan leader from the cave helped the sobbing girl up and led her to the one bench in the room. He cleared away the people sitting there and had the girl lie down. Then he knelt and took her hands into his and spoke to her in a hushed tone Sara couldn't quite make out. Sara took in her surroundings. The cell was half underground. There were barred windows on 3 of the walls, a little above eye level, and through them Sara could only see a small portion of the sky, which was turning dark. An older Mayan man approached Dak and Sara and stood there with his arms crossed. "What is the most important thing in the world?" he asked. "What?" Dak said. He turned to Sara and mouthed, "The riddle." "I know," Sara mouthed back. "Just as I suspected," the Mayan man said. "You don't have an answer." "No, we do!" Dak shouted. "The most important thing in the world is... corn?" The man scoffed and moved away from Dak and Sara. "Asymmetrical tortillas?" Dak called out after him. The man didn't even turn around. Sara led Dak to an empty corner of the cell. "That question was right out of the riddle," Dak said. "We just have to figure out the answer, and we'll be a step closer to solving it." Sara leaned her back against the dirty prison wall and let herself slide down to a sitting position, her face falling into her hands. She'd never felt so defeated in her life, or depressed. She was only 11 years old. Wasn't 11 too young to process the things she'd experienced over the past 24 hours? The realization that she'd found her parents face down in her flooded barn, watching a man get taken down by an arrow when he didn't even do anything? Being thrown into a prison? She couldn't stand the way the Mayas were treated by the monks. How could a foreign people come waltzing into someone else's village and start telling them what to believe? To make things worse, the Mayas didn't trust her and Dak just because they didn't know some secret code word. Dak sat down next to her. "We'll be okay, Sara." She looked up at him. "Will we, Dak? Because I'm not so sure anymore." He pointed at her satchel holding the infinity ring. "You still have the ring, and I have the square. We can use this time to regroup and figure out the riddle." Sara shook her head. "What's the point, Dak? Are we really making a difference?" "Of course we are," Dak said. "What's going on? You usually have such a good attitude." Sara paused, fighting the lump in her throat. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Dak. We're not actually fixing history at all. We're not making anything better for anyone." She motioned toward the Mayas. "They just want to live their lives and learn about the world and follow their traditions, and they can't even sneak off to a cave to honor what they believe in? One of them has to pay with his life?" "We already talked about this," Dak said. He looked away from Sara for a few seconds, like he was thinking. Sara saw over his shoulder that the Mayan leader was now pacing the cell. "The point of fixing the breaks," Dak said, "isn't to make history more morally correct." "Why not?" Sara said. "Why aren't we trying to make the world a better place?" Dak shrugged. "I don't know, Sara. Sometimes we are, I think, but we're just 2 kids. 2.5 if you count Loverboy. The point is, we're sent to each place to fix a break, not humanity." "So you don't ever question it?" "No, I do," Dak said. "But at the end of the day, I trust the historians. They've been working to avert the cataclysm and defeat the SQ longer than we've been alive." Sara stared at Dak. She wanted to come right out and tell him how she'd been given a glimpse of the unspeakable cataclysm, but she couldn't. She had to keep this cancerous knowledge to herself. Sara grabbed at her own hair and pulled, saying, "I don't know if I can go on, Dak. I really don't." "But you have to," the Mayan leader said. "And you will." Sara looked up. saw the young man now hovering over her and Dak, his fists clenched. "There will always be injustice," he continued, "in all things, and many times we will not be able to alter these things, but what we can always do is lift our heads and continue on. That part is in our control." Sara felt embarrassed that the man had overheard her whining. She must have sounded like a spoiled brat. "They can lock us behind these walls," the man said, shaking the bars in the window to the left of Sara and Dak. "All of us, the entire village. But in our minds, we will always remain free. Remember that." He reached a hand out and helped Sara to her feet, saying, "I am Bakab." "Sara," she answered, trying to seem as respectful as possible, because she already admired the man. She'd seen how all the people in the cave, many of them much older, were hanging on his every word. Dak elbowed Sara in the arm and cleared his throat. "Oh," she said, "and this is my friend Dak." "Hi," Dak said. "A pleasure to meet you both," Bakab said. "You're not from around here, obviously, but where you come from does not concern me. It is where you are now that matters, and that is with us." Sara glanced over at the rest of the Mayas. A few of them didn't seem as eager to accept her and Dak, probably because they didn't know the answer to the question from the riddle. "So, how do we get out of here?" Dak asked. "We have our ways," Bakab said. "This is my 4th time inside this very cell. What they fail to understand is that I have a key in my room. Late this evening, my younger brother will realize I'm not home. The first place he will check is the prison cell, and he knows to bring the key." "Wait, you have a key?" Dak said. Bakab grinned. "When I'm not organizing our gatherings, I work as a locksmith." Seeing the young man's grin made Sara feel better. She, too, wanted to be the kind of person who could grin in the face of adversity. "We can't remain here long," a second Mayan man said. "If the great storm comes as predicted, it will flood the cell. They will leave us to drown." "No one here is going to drown," Bakab said. He turned back to Dak and Sara and said, "This is my younger cousin, Kinich. He is an excellent locksmith's assistant, and he has traveled extensively, but he worries too much." "Wait, there's supposed to be another great storm?" Dak said. He banged on the stone wall with the heel of his hand. "Sure hope these bad boys are built stronger than they used to be." Bakab lifted Sara's chin so that their eyes met. "Young sister," he said, "you have questions swimming in your eyes." "I don't know," she said, embarrassed that she looked so uncertain. "Why are they even doing this? You weren't hurting anyone tonight." "The monks are frustrated. Their plan is to take over every village from sea to sea, but in order to do this peacefully and efficiently, they must first convert my people to their religion. Then we will believe the land is theirs by divine right. You see?" "So that's why you gathered in the cave," Sara said. "That, and the acoustics make my voice sound nice," Bakab said with another grin. "They've been threatening us," Kinich said. "Diego de Landa, one of the leaders of the Franciscan monks, says if we don't obey, he will get rid of everything we hold sacred." "Oh, wow," Dak said. "I've totally read about this. That de Landa dude gets so mad he orders an auto-da-fe where he—" Sara stepped on Dak's foot to cut him off. "Ow!" Dak shrieked. "You're speculating, of course," Sara said, shooting Dak a dirty look. "Oh, right." Dak turned to Bakab. "What I meant to say is, aren't you guys afraid something bad might happen to your codices and stuff?" Sara noticed that Kinich was staring at Dak. "How could you know something that has yet to happen?" he asked. "No, I don't," Dak said. Sometimes I get my verb tenses confused." "My hope is that a highly spiritual man like De Landa," Bakab said, "would never stoop so low as confiscating our history." "Well, I wouldn't hope too hard," Dak said quietly, so only Sara could hear. Kinich was whispering something into Bacab's ear now. Sara pulled Dak aside and said, "Maybe this is the break we're supposed to fix." After talking with Bacab, she felt suddenly re-energized, like she was ready to fight again. Maybe this was the mark of a great leader. "That's it!" Dak nearly shouted. "We have to stop Delanda's auto-da-fe." Sara put a finger to her lips for Dak to lower his voice. "So, at some point, are you planning to explain what the heck an auto-da-fe is?" she said. "Or do you just enjoy hearing yourself say it?" "Auto-da-fe, auto-da-fe, auto-da-fe." Dak smiled. "Just kidding, dude. An auto-da-fe is..." Before Dak could finish, a few of the Mayas got up suddenly and started converging around the far window. Bacab and Kinich hurried over to join them. Sara and Dak stood on their tiptoes near the back of the crowd to try to see what was going on. All Sara could see was the bottom portion of a monk's robe on the other side of the window. Someone was there. And that someone was now kneeling down to look inside the cell. Sara's eyes widened. It was Rick, dressed like a Franciscan monk. "What do you want?" one of the Mayas barked at him. "To speak with Dak and Sara," Rick said. "I'm not an actual monk, I promise." "Rick!" Sara shouted over the crowd. "Why should we believe you?" another Mayan man said. Sara started pushing through the pack. If she could just get to him, she could explain. Dak suddenly weaseled right past her, though, and lunged for the window, holding out a piece of jewelry. Rick reached his hand through the narrow bars and took it. "It looks like the one you lost," Dak shouted. "I thought maybe you'd want it." "Thanks," Rick said, slipping it into the bag hanging off of the rope belt of his robe. "Why are you here?" a woman shouted at Rick. "Haven't you people done enough for one night?" Several other Mayas began peppering Rick with questions, too, until Bacab shouted, "Silence!" The entire cell went quiet. "Thank you," Bacab said. "Let me ask the boy our question before we proceed any further." The Mayas nodded and made a path for Bacab to get to the window. As he wrapped his hands around the bars, he looked up at Rick and said, "What is the most important thing in the world, young man?" Sara watched Rick look to the ground, confused. She was about to move toward the window so she could explain that they weren't from around here when Rick suddenly raised his eyes to Bacab and said, "Friendship?" All at once, the Mayas looked at one another, nodding, and began reaching their arms through the bars to shake hands with Rick. Sara turned to Dak, who was already staring at her with a puzzled look on his face. He motioned toward Rick and said, "What the?" Sara shrugged and told him, "You took the words right out of my mouth." Chapter 15. A Necessary Detour. As Rick hurried away from the subterranean prison cell, he kept repeating in his head the name of the boy he'd just been asked to locate, the boy that Bacab claimed would have a key to the cell. O'Keep, O'Keep, O'Keep. He couldn't allow himself to forget. But at the same time, he was also thinking about the ancient locket Dak had handed him through the prison bars. It was the only reason he'd been able to answer Bacab's strange question. In a conversation with Kisa, he remembered telling her that the most important thing in the world was having friends. So he threw it out there to Bacab. But he was completely shocked that he'd gotten it right. Rick pulled the locket out now as he moved through the village looking for the boy. It was rusted shut, the metal on both sides dull and badly dented. There was no way it was the locket Kisa had tried to give him before he warped away with Dak and Sara. Even if it was, would he actually want it? The girl had done nothing but confuse him. One minute she seemed so excited for him to stay, the next minute she was ordering him out of her village. Rick was tempted to boot the locket right into the bushes. He didn't, though. He slipped it back into his belt's bag and continued repeating the boy's name in his head. O'Keep, O'Keep, O'Keep. Rick had been walking around for a half hour before he spotted a small group of Mayan boys playing on a ball court. He called down to them. "By any chance, is one of you guys named O'Keep?" The boys all looked at one another, shaking their heads. "You sure?" Rick said. "I'm not a real monk, I promise. and I have an important message from Bacab." He wished he could ditch the Franciscan robe he was wearing. It was making the kids nervous. "He might be getting stuff out of the cave," one of the boys offered. "Did something bad happen?" another boy asked. "I don't think so," Rick said, not wanting to alarm them. "Bacab just asked that I find O'Keefe." "You should try the cave," the first boy said. Rick thanked them and started in the direction of the path that would lead him to the cave. He looked down at his robe, feeling entirely out of place. When he left Dak and Sara earlier, he had ducked into the church to be alone and saw the robe hanging over a chair. He changed into it without much thought, other than he no longer wanted to be wearing the clothes he'd worn when he knew Kisa. A new outfit, he had told himself, might help give him a fresh perspective. It didn't, of course. He left the church feeling just as confused as ever. Kisa must have realized something truly awful about him to change her mind so quickly. Rick pulled the locket out again. He just needed to get rid of it. All it did was remind him of what happened. Instead of hurling it into the bushes, though, he fired it at the ground as hard as he could. Then he sat down on a boulder and looked up into the sky. The moon and stars were out, and he thought how it was the same moon and stars that had hovered over Izamal almost 1,000 years ago. The sky didn't need a time machine to witness all that went on in the world, which included the time he'd spent with Kisa. The air was warm and humid. Far off to the east, he saw storm clouds. He watched them for a few seconds, trying to determine how quickly they were approaching. Then he shifted his attention back to the locket on the ground. He was surprised to see that it had broken into 2 pieces. He walked over and picked them up, and stared at the inside of the back half where a single glyph had been written. Observatory. The handwriting reminded him of the message Kisa had carved into the boulder when she'd left him the snake bracelet. Rick got chills as he looked up at the tall observatory. Could it really be Kisa trying to send him a message? The path that led up to the cave was just past the observatory. If Rick hurried, he could take a quick look inside before heading up the hill. He shoved the locket pieces back into his bag and took off running. The 2 monks near the front entrance didn't pay Rick any mind, most likely because of the robe he was wearing. He was able to duck right inside the huge observatory and check things out. It was quite old, though still functioning. Parts of the walls were peeling and cracked, the center of the ground floor was flat, and the roof was open at the very top so that Rick could see the sky. All around the main part of the observatory were doors, maybe a dozen of them. Rick knew what he was doing was insane, trying to figure out the meaning of a single glyph clue written almost 1,000 years ago. Or maybe it wasn't a clue at all. Maybe it had been written by someone other than Kisa. Or what if Kisa had left the clue for someone else? This version of the observatory didn't even exist yet when she tried to hand him the locket. Another question started circling through his head. Why would a girl give a clue to someone she didn't even want around? Rick moved around the interior of the observatory anyway, opening every door, peering inside. They were mostly small rooms with new desks and chairs. 3 of the doors were locked. One led to a staircase. Rick took the skinny stairs all the way up to the ceiling and looked back down at the ground floor, trying to figure out what might be significant about an observatory. But it was all so ordinary. There was a thin walkway up near the dome. He stepped out onto it, moved carefully around every inch looking for some other kind of clue. But it was just a walkway, nothing more. He eventually climbed back down the stairs, passing the ground floor and ducking into the basement. He opened the door and felt his way down the dark hallway, sliding his hands against the wall. He tried a door along the way that was locked. Then he saw that there was an open room at the far end of the hall, with what looked like candlelight flickering within. Rick walked faster through the darkness and peeked inside. There were 3 women sitting on simple wooden chairs, sorting through wooden boxes. One looked up at Rick, her eyes growing wide with surprise. "Who are you?" she demanded, dropping what looked like another locket inside the box. "And what are you doing in here?" All 3 women picked up their sewing and stood up, kicking the boxes behind their feet.
"We've been cleared by Brother Delanda to do our embroideries in here," the shortest of them said. "They're for the church," the first woman added. "Don't worry," Rick told the women. "I'm not a real monk. I was just looking for a girl." It was clear they weren't doing anything for the church. "A girl?" the short woman asked. "No one is allowed to be down here but the three of us with our embroidery." "A woman, I mean," Rick corrected himself. "She lived a long, long time ago. Her name was Kisa." The women all looked at one another, shaking their heads. "Her uncle was King Ichik," Rick added. "I believe he was responsible for building this observatory." "I've never heard of anyone named Kisa," the short woman said. "Or a King Ichik, for that matter. Have you?" she asked her friends. "Never," they both said. The taller woman glanced at the box behind her. Then she turned back to Rick and lowered her eyes. He saw that she had a large birthmark on the right side of her face. Rick nodded. "Thanks for your help. Where are you from?" the woman with the birthmark said, cutting him off. "Me?" Rick said. He didn't quite know how to answer. "Well, I'm from a faraway village." The woman continued staring at him. "And what is the name of this village?" Rick leaned against the wall behind him and said, "Oh, it's very small. Most people have never heard of it." The other two women were looking at the woman with the birthmark. "Anyway," Rick said, pushing off the wall, "I'm sorry to have disturbed you." The women remained standing in front of their boxes until Rick left the room. He hurried back up the stairs and out of the observatory, trying to forget about the cryptic message inside the locket, and the women, and the fact that there may be additional lockets inside those wooden boxes they were hiding. Right now, he needed to concentrate on finding the boy Bacab had asked him to find. Rick started up the dark path toward the cave when he collided suddenly with someone hurrying back down the path. They both tumbled into the bushes. Rick, slightly dazed, raised his head to find a boy lying in the bushes beside him. "Okib?" he asked hesitantly. The boy sat up and looked at him. Rick remembered his robe and said, "Don't worry, I'm not a real monk. But is it really you, Okib?" The boy shrugged and looked around. Rick scrambled to his feet and leaned down over the boy. "A man named Bacab asked me to find you. He's in the village holding cell with two of my friends, and he claims you'll know what to do." The boy stood up. He looked about Dak's age. "I knew it!" he cried. "Knew what?" Rick asked. "There was nothing left in the cave." The boy wiped a hand down his face. "They took it all. Everything." "Someone stole from you?" Rick asked. "The monks did," the boy said. "Why won't they just leave us alone? We're not hurting anyone." Rick felt the injustice in his chest. "Come," he told the boy. "I'll take you to Bacab." "No," Okib said. "My brother says I must always wait until deep into the night, when everyone has fallen asleep. Then I will bring him the key." Rick looked out over Itzamal. For the first time since they arrived in this new time period, he wondered about the break they needed to fix. He'd been moping around long enough. It was time to get back to his life's work, being a historian. "Follow me," he told Okib with a new sense of determination. "We can wait inside the observatory. You tell me when the time is right to free your people, and I will come along to assist you." Okib looked up at him, nodding. They started back down the path together, Rick gripping the locket pieces in his satchel and promising himself he would remain absolutely focused for the remainder of the mission.